Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in amma ba'd. During the 200th year celebration of the birth of Karl Marx, the founder of Marxism, Chinese President Xi Jinping declared that, like a spectacular sunrise, the theory of Marxism illuminated the path of humanity's exploration of the law of history and humanity's search for its own liberation. He would go on to claim that Marx pointed out the direction with scientific theory towards an ideal society with no oppression or exploitation, where every person would enjoy equality and freedom. Yeah, that's right, freedom, just what China is all about. Given that Xi's words were uttered in Marxist China, those in attendance had no choice but to agree with them. Now, on the same day, 7,500 kilometers away, speaking in Trier in Germany, which is the birthplace of Karl Marx, European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker offered a somewhat generous appraisal of his own. He said that now Marx stands for things which he was not responsible for and which he didn't cause, because many of the things he wrote down were redrafted into the opposite. It is not entirely clear what Juncker meant by this. Marxism, after all, has inflicted untold misery on tens of millions of people who have been forced to live under regimes waving its banner. For much of the 20th century, 40% of humanity suffered famines, gulags, censorship, and other forms of repression at the hands of the self-proclaimed Marxists. In his speech, Juncker seemed to be alluding to the standard counter-argument that communist atrocities throughout the 20th century were due to some sort of distortion of Marxist thought for which the man himself can't be held responsible. Is this argument really true? We shall see to that. Marx spent most of his life analyzing the political economy of the industrializing mid-19th century West, but his enduring relevance owes more to his ideas for the future and the implications they would have for society. In considering his legacy, this area of his thought cannot be ignored. Marx regarded private property as the source of all evil in the emerging capitalist societies of his day. Accordingly, he believed that only by abolishing private property could society's class divisions be healed and a harmonious future ensured. Under communism, his collaborator Friedrich Engels later claimed the state itself would become unnecessary and wither away. These assertions were not made as speculations, but rather as though they were scientific claims about what the future held in store. Marx theorized that human history is best viewed as a series of class struggles between social forces that have contradictory interests. For example, the class struggle between slaves and their masters, between the feudal lords and their subjects, and in his day, the class struggle between capitalists and their workers. He called this dialectical materialism. The weird thing about dialectical materialism is that Marx seemed to cobble together from pieces of two existing philosophies that contradicted each other. These two philosophies were Hegelian spiritualism of German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who was an idealist, and materialism. Marx believed that he was building upon these two philosophies, but in reality they were incompatible. The Prussian government and the intellectuals of Prussian universities preferred Hegelian spiritualism because it essentially said that history was guided by the world spirit, which acted through the great men of history and government to bring about its will. Hegelian spiritualism justified their privileged position by giving them a pretext for ruling over the lower classes, since the world spirit had conveniently picked them out for the task. The materialists, on the other hand, thought that reality was just what you see is what you get, and as such didn't think that the Prussian aristocracy had any right to rule and denied any sort of divine entity. Now Marx here tweaks the Hegelian dialectic. Now Hegel is a perplexing philosopher to understand and very difficult to read, even for the academic and learned people. Despite his complicated style, he did pass on one very famous idea that was adopted and used by Marx. It's called the Hegelian dialectic and goes something like this. In a society, you have a prevailing doctrine which is widely accepted and taken for granted by the most people. But this cannot remain indefinitely so. At some time, a movement will come along proposing to challenge and overturn the prevailing wisdom, saying that it is nonsensical and should be changed and replaced with a new one. Hegelians call the first doctrine the thesis and the opposite doctrine the antithesis. But here's where it gets interesting. The antithesis never successfully overturns the thesis completely. Instead, the two doctrines begin to fuse together, creating a synthesis, which combines elements of both. The third doctrine becomes the dominant thesis of a new era. But no sooner has this process completed than the whole thing is poised to start again. This new prevailing wisdom, combining elements of the old movement and the new one which opposes it, will soon come to be opposed by a new antithesis which opposes that. Hegel believed that this process was a law that governed history, but it also mirrored the thinking process and described the logic by which people come to understand the world itself. Marx extracted the dialectic and fused it into his own philosophy, hoping to prove that socialism was bound to come about by dialectical process of class struggle in which the workers eventually threw off the chains of their capitalist overlords to create a classless society in which everyone would be equal and work for the common good. This all sounds very nice and cute, but of course it is all rubbish. Marx's theory of history, dialectical materialism, has since been proved wrong and dangerous in every respect. The great 20th century philosopher Karl Popper, one of Marx's strongest critics, rightly called him a false prophet. And if more evidence were needed, the countries that embraced capitalism in the 20th century went on to become democratic, open and prosperous societies, something which, according to Marx, should never have been possible. His very famous work, The Communist Manifesto, which he co-authored with Friedrich Engels, begins by saying, "All history is the history of class struggles." All history. Was there really nothing else than conflicts between different economic groups? For Marx, apparently, there was never any other dimension of human experience worthy of independent consideration. No history of technology, of ideas, of culture, of faith. He comes to this one-dimensional schema by deflating the philosophy of history he had found in his teacher, the German philosopher Hegel. In place of Hegelian complexity, he offered simplistic claims to predict the future in the form of developmental laws of capitalism. By contrast, every regime that has rejected capitalism in the name of Marxism has failed, and not by coincidence or as a result of some unfortunate doctrinal misunderstanding on the part of the Marxist followers. By abolishing private ownership and establishing a state control of the economy, one not only deprives the society of entrepreneurship needed to propel it forward, one also abolishes freedom itself. Because Marxism treats all contradictions in society as the products of a class struggle that will disappear when private property does, dissent after the establishment of communism is impossible. By definition, any challenge to the new order must be an illegitimate remnant of the oppressive order that came before. Thus, Marxist regimes have in fact been logical extensions of his doctrine. Marx, who died 34 years before the Russian Revolution, was not responsible for the gulags, and yet his ideas clearly were. In his landmark 3-study volume Main Currents of Marxism, the Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski, who became a leading critic of Marxism after having embraced it in his youth, notes that Marx showed almost no interest in people as though they didn't exist. As such, evil and suffering in his eyes had no meaning except as instruments of liberation. They were purely social facts, not an essential part of the human condition. Kolakowski's insight help us to explain why regimes that have embraced Marx's mechanical and deterministic doctrine inevitably must turn to totalitarianism when confronting the reality of a complex society. They have not always fully succeeded, but the results have been tragic. The president of China, Xi Jinping, sees China's economic development over the past few decades as cast iron proof of Marxism's continued validity. But if anything, it is exactly the other way around. Remember that it was China of pure communism that produced the famine and terror of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Mao's decision to deprive farmers of the land and entrepreneurs of their firms had predictably disastrous results, and the Communist Party of China has since abandoned that doctrine approach. Under Mao's successor Deng Xiaoping, the CPC leader, the Communist Party's leader, launched China's great economic opening up. After 1978, it began to restore private ownership and permit entrepreneurships, and the results have been nothing short of spectacular. If China's development is being held back by anything today, it is the remnants of Marxism that are still visible in its inefficient state-owned enterprise and the repression of dissent. Over the past 100 years, there has been more than 24 attempts to build a socialist or communist society. It has been tried in Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Albania, Poland, Vietnam, Bulgaria, Romania, Czechoslovakia, North Korea, Hungary, China, East Germany, Cuba, Tanzania, Laos, South Yemen, Somalia, Congo, Ethiopia, Cambodia, Mozambique, Angola, Nicaragua, Venezuela, etc. All of these attempts have ended in varying degrees of failure. It has failed so many times in so many different variants and in so many radically different settings. Not to forget the millions of people that have died in order to implement this. For those who want to talk about Marx, to erect statues in his memory, or to defend him as some big philosopher, it is time to show some intellectual integrity and face up to the crimes committed in his name. It is wrong to say, as we often hear, that his program of communism was a good idea but poorly implemented. On the contrary, it is a bad idea from the start, and the brutality that always accompanied it was a consequence of its inherent core principles. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.